Book 3, Chapter 9 of The Lancashire Witches. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Andy Minter. The Lancashire Witches, A Romance of Pendle Forest, by William Harrison Ainsworth. Book 3, Houghton Tower. Chapter 9. The Banquet. On the King's return to Houghton Tower, orders were given by Sir Richard for the immediate service of the banquet, it being the hospitable baronet's desire that festivities should succeed each other so rapidly as to allow of no tedium. The coup d'oeil of the banquet hall on the monarch's entrance was magnificent, panelled with black lustrous oak, and lighted by mullioned windows filled with stained glass, and emblazoned with the armorial bearings of the family. The vast and lofty hall was hung with banners, and decorated with panoplies and trophies of the chase. 3 long tables ran down it, each containing 100 covers. At the lower end were stationed the heralds, the pursuivants, and a band of yeomen of the guard, with the royal badge, a demi-rose, crowned, impaled with the demi-thistle, woven in gold, on their doublets, and having fringed pole-axes over their shoulders. Behind them was a richly carved oak screen, concealing the passages leading to the buttery and kitchens, in which the clerk of the kitchen, the pantlers, and the yeomen of the cellar and ewery were hurrying to and fro. Above the screen was a gallery, occupied by the trumpeters and minstrels, and over all was a noble rafter roof. The tables were profusely spread, and glittered with silver dishes of extraordinary size and splendour, as well as with flagons and goblets of the same material and rare design. The guests, all of whom were assembled, were outnumbered by the prodigious array of serving men, pages, and yeomen waiters, in the yellow and red liveries of the Stuart. Flourishes of trumpets announced the coming of the monarch, who was preceded by Sir Richard Houghton, bearing a white wand, and ushered with much ceremony to his place. At the upper end of the hall was a raised floor, and on either side of it an oriel window, glowing with painted glass. On this dais the King's table was placed, underneath a canopy of state embroidered with the royal arms, and bearing James's kindly motto, Beati Pacificii. Seats were reserved at it for the Duke of Buckingham and Richmond, the Earls of Pembroke and Nottingham, the Lords Howard of Effingham and Grey of Groby, Sir Gilbert Houghton, and the Bishop of Chester. These constituted the favoured guests. Grace having been said by the bishop, the whole company took their seats, and the general stillness hitherto prevailing throughout the vast hall was broken instantaneously by the clatter of trenchers. A famous feast it was, and worthy of commemoration. Masters Morris and Miller, the 2 cooks who contrived it, as well as the labourers for the ranges, for the pastries, for the boiled meats, for the pullets, performed their respective parts to admiration. The result was all that could be desired. The fare was solid and substantial, consisting of dishes which could be cut and come to again. Among the roast meats were chines of beef, haunches of venison, gigots of mutton, fatted geese, capons, turkeys, and sucking pigs. Amongst the boiled, pullets, lamb, and veal, but baked meats chiefly abounded, and amongst them were to be found red deer pasty, hare pie, gammon of bacon pie, and baked wild boar. With the salads, which were nothing more than what would nowadays be termed vegetables, were mixed all kinds of soused fish, arranged according to the sewer's directions. The salads spread about the table, the fricassees mixed with them, the boiled meats among the fricassees, roast meats among the boiled, baked meats among the roast, and carbonadoes amongst the baked. This was the first course merely. In the second were all kinds of game and wildfowl, roast herons, 3 in a dish, bitterns, cranes, bustards, curlews, dotterels, and peewits. Besides these there were lumber pies, marrow pies, quince pies, artichoke pies, florentines, and innumerable other good things. Some dishes were specifically reserved for the King's table, as a baked swan, a roast peacock, and the jowl of a sturgeon, soused. These, and a piece of roast beef, formed the principal dishes. The attendants at the royal table comprised such gentlemen as wore Sir Richard Houghton's liveries, and among these, of course, were Nicholas Assheton and Sherborne. On seeing the former, the king immediately inquired about his deliverer, and on hearing he was at the lower tables, desired he might be sent for; and as Richard soon afterwards appeared, having on his return from the chase changed his sombre apparel for gayer attire, James smiled graciously upon him, and more than once, as a mark of special favour, took the wine cup from his hands. The king did ample justice to the good things before him, and especially to the beef, which he found so excellent that the carver had to help him for the second time. Sir Richard Houghton ventured to express his gratification that his Majesty found the meat good. "Indeed, it is generally admitted," he said, "that our Lancashire beef is well fed and well flavoured." "Well flavoured!" exclaimed James, as he swallowed the last juicy morsel. "It is delicious. Finer beef nae man ever put teeth into, and I only wish all my loving subjects had as good a dinner as I hae this day eaten. What joint do you call it, Sir Richard?" he asked, with eyes evidently twinkling with a premeditated jest. "This dish," replied the host, somewhat surprised, "this, sire, is a loin of beef." "A loin!" exclaimed James, taking the carving knife from the sewer, who stood by. "By my faith, that is not title honourable enough for joint so worthy. It wants a dignity, and it shall hae it. Henceforth," he added, touching the meat with the flat of the long blade, as if placing the sword on the back of a knight expectant, "henceforth it shall be sirloin, and see ye call it sae. Give me a cup of wine, Master Richard Assheton." All the nobles at the table laughed loudly at the monarch's jest, and as it was soon passed down to those at the lower table, the hall resounded with laughter, in which page and attendant of every degree joined, to the great satisfaction of the good-natured originator of the merriment. Note: there is a laughable tradition, said Nichols, still generally current in Lancashire, that our night-making monarch knighted at a banquet in Houghton Tower a loin of beef, the part ever since called the sirloin; and it is added by the same authority, if the king did not give the sirloin its name, he might notwithstanding have indulged in a pun on the already coined word, the etymology of which was, then as now, as little regarded as the thing signified is well approved. Nichols' Progress of James I, Volume 3. "My dear dad and gossip appears in unwonted good spirits to-day," observed the Duke of Buckingham. "Ah, with good reason, Steenie," replied the king, "for we dinna mind when we had better sport, although always excepting the boar hunt, when we should have been ripped up by the cursed creature's tusks. But for this braw laddie," he added, pointing to Richard, "you mun see what can be done for him, Steenie. We mun hae him at court." "Your Majesty's wishes have only to be expressed to be fulfilled," replied Buckingham, somewhat drily. "Were I the lad, I wouldna place so mickle dependence on the Duke's promises," remarked Archie Armstrong in a low tone to Nicholas. "Has your Majesty made any further inquiries about the girl suspected of witchcraft?" inquired Buckingham, renewing the conversation. "Ah, wisht, Steenie, wisht!" cried James. "Didna you see her yourself this morning?" he added, in a low tone. "Ah, I recollect you werena at the chase. Aweel, I hae conferred with her, and I'm sair perplexed in the matter. She's a well-favoured lassie as any in the realm, and answers decorously and doucely. Sooth to say, her looks and manners are mightily in her favour." "Then you mean to dismiss the matter without further investigation?" observed Buckingham. "I always thought your Majesty delighted to exercise your sagacity in detecting the illusions practised by Satan and his worshippers." "Why, sae we do," replied James. "But bend your bonny head this way till we whisper in your ear. We hae a device for finding it all out, which canna fail, and when ye ken it, ye'll applaud your dear dad's wisdom and perfect mastery of the whole science of kingcraft." "I wish your Majesty would make me acquainted with this notable scheme," replied Buckingham, with ill-concealed contempt. "I might make it more certain of success." "Na, we shanna let the cat out of the bag just yet," returned the king. "We mean it as a surprise to you." "Then, whatever be the result, it is certain to answer the effect intended," observed the Duke.
"Gae wi' you, you're ever sceptical, Steenie, ever misdoubting your ain dear dad and gossip," rejoined James. "But you shall find we hinna earned the title of the British Solomon for nothing."
Soon after this the king arose, and was ushered to his apartments by Sir Richard Houghton, with the same ceremony as had been observed on his entrance. He was followed by all the nobles, and Nicholas and the others, being released from their duties, repaired to the lower end of the hall to dine. The revel was now sufficiently boisterous, for, as the dames had departed at the same time as the monarch, all restraint was cast aside, the wine-cup flowed freely, and the rafters rang with laughter. Under ordinary circumstances, Richard would have shrunk from such a scene, but he now had a part to play, and therefore essayed to laugh at each jest, and to appear as reckless as his neighbours. He was glad, however, when the signal for general dispersion was given, for though Sir Richard Houghton was unwilling to stint his guests, he was fearful, if they sat too long over their wine, some disturbances might ensue, and indeed, when the revellers came forth and dispersed within the base court, their flushed cheeks, loud voices, and unsteady gait, showed that their potations had already been deep enough. Meanwhile, quite as much mirth was taking place out of doors as had occurred within the banqueting hall. As soon as the king sat down to dinner, according to promise, the gates were thrown open, and the crowd outside admitted. The huge roast was then taken down, carved, and distributed among them, the only difficulty experienced being in regard to trenchers, and various and extraordinary were the contrivances resorted to supply the deficiency. This circumstance, however, served to heighten the fun, and as several casks of stout ale were broached at the same time, universal hilarity prevailed. Still, in the midst of so vast a concourse, many component parts, of which had now begun to experience the effects of the potent liquor, some little manifestation of disorder might naturally be expected. But all such was speedily quelled by the yeomen of the guard, and other officials appointed for the purpose, and amidst the uproar and confusion, harmony generally prevailed. While elbowing his way through the crowd, Nicholas felt his sleeve plucked, and turning perceived Nance Redfern, who signed him to follow her, and there was something in her manner that left him no alternative but compliance. Nance passed on rapidly, and entered the doorway of a building where it might be supposed they would be free from interruption. "What do you want with me, Nance?" asked the squire, somewhat impatiently. "I must beg to observe that I cannot be troubled farther on your account, and am greatly afraid aspersions may be thrown on my character if I am seen talking with you." "A few words with me winna injure your character, squire," rejoined Nance, "and it's on your account, and not on my own, that I have brought you here. I have important information to give you. What will you say when I tell you that Jem Device, Elizabeth Device, and her daughter Jennet are here, breeding mischief against you, Richard Assheton, and Alison?" "The devil!" ejaculated Nicholas.
"And you'll find it the devil, I can promise you, unless their plans be frustrated," said Nance.
"That can easily be done," replied Nicholas. "I'll cause them to be arrested at once."
Nay, that canna be," rejoined Nance. "You mun bide your time."
"What, and allow such miscreants to go at large and work any malice they please against me and my friends?" replied Nicholas. "Show me where they are, Nance, or I must take you a prisoner."
"Nay, you winna do that, squire," she replied, in a tone of good-humoured defiance. "You winna do it for two good reasons. First, because you'd be harming a friend who wants to serve you, and will do so if you let her. And second, because if you were to raise a finger agin me, I'd deprive you of speech and notion. When the right moment comes, you should strike. But it's ne'er come yet. The fruit is ne'er ripe enough to gather. I'm as anxious as you can be that the whole of the Demdike brood should be swept away, and it shan be if you'll leave it to me."
"Well, I commit the matter entirely to you," said Nicholas.
"Apparently it cannot be in better hands. But are you aware that Christopher Demdike's a prisoner here in Hoghton Tower? He was taken this morning in the park." "I know it," replied Nance, "and I know also why he went there, and it were my intention to have revealed his black design to you. However, it's been ordered differently. But in respect to t'others, wait till I give you the signal. They're disguised, but even if you see 'em and recognise 'em, dunna let it appear till I give you the word, or you'll spoil all." "Your injunction shall be obeyed implicitly, Nance," rejoined Nicholas. "I now have perfect reliance upon you. But when shall I see you again?" "That depends on the circumstances," she replied. "To-neet, maybe to-morrow neet. My plans mun be guided by those of others. But when next you see me, you will have to act." And without waiting an answer, she rushed out of the doorway, and mingling with the crowd was instantly lost to view, while Nicholas, full of the intelligence he had received, betook himself slowly to his lodgings. Scarcely were they gone, when a door which had been standing ajar near them was opened wide, and disclosed the keen visage of Master Potts. "Here's a pretty plot hatching. Here's a nice discovery I've made," soliloquised the attorney. "The whole Demdike family, with the exception of the old witch herself, whom I saw burnt on Pendle Hill, are at Hoghton Tower. This shall be made known to the king. I'll have Nicholas Assheton arrested at once, and the woman with him, whom I recognise as Nance Redfern. It will be a wonderful stroke, and will raise me highly in his Majesty's estimations. Yet, stay, will not this interfere with my other plans with Jennet? Let me reflect. I must go cautiously to work. Besides, if I cause Nicholas to be arrested, Nance will escape, and then I shall have no clue as to the others. No, I must watch Nicholas closely, and take upon myself all the credit of the discovery. Perhaps through Jennet I may be able to detect their disguises. At all events, I will keep a sharp look-out. Affairs are now drawing to a close, and I have only, like a wary and experienced fowler, to lay my nets cleverly to catch the whole covey." And with these ruminations he likewise went forth into the base court. The rest of the day was one round of festivity and enjoyment, in which all classes participated. There were trials of skill and strength, running, wrestling, and cudgelling matches, with an infinite variety of country games and shows. Towards 5 o'clock, a rush car, decked with flowers and ribbons, and bestridden by men bearing garlands, was drawn up in front of the central building of the tower, in an open window of which sat James, a well-pleased spectator of the different pastimes going forward, and several lively dances were executed by a troop of male and female morris dancers, accompanied by a tabor and pipe. But though this show was sufficiently attractive, it lacked the spirit of that performed at Whalley, while the character of Maid Marian, which then found so charming a representative in Alizon, was now personated by a man. And if Nicholas Assheton, who was among the bystanders, was not deceived, that man was Jem Device. Enraged by this discovery, the squire was about to seize the ruffian, but calling to mind Nance's counsel, he refrained, and Jem, if indeed it were he, retired with the largesse bestowed by the royal hand as a reward for his uncouth gambols. The rush cart and morris dancers having disappeared, another drollery was exhibited, called The Fool and his 5 Sons, the names of the hopeful offspring of the sapient sire being Pickle Herring, Blue Hose, Pepper Hose, Ginger Hose, and Jack Allspice. The humour of this piece, though not particularly refined, seemed to be appreciated by the audience generally, as well as by the monarch, who laughed heartily at its coarse buffoonery. Next followed the plough and sword dance, the principal actors being a number of grotesque figures armed with swords, some of whom were yoked to a plough, on which sat a piper, playing lustily while dragged along. The plough was guided by a man clothed in a bearskin, with a fur cap on his head, and a long tail like that of a lion dangling behind him. In this hirsute personage, who was intended to represent the wood demon Hobthurst, Nicholas again detected Jem Device, and again was strongly tempted to disobey Nance's instructions and denounce him, the rather that he recognised in an attendant female, in a fantastic dress, the ruffian's mother, Elizabeth, but he once more desisted. As soon as the mummers arrived in front of the king, the dance began,
With their swords held upright, the party took hands and wheeled rapidly round the plough, keeping time to a merry measure played by the piper, who still maintained his seat. Suddenly the ring was enlarged to double its former size, each man extending his sword to his neighbour, who took hold of the point, after which a hexagonal figure was formed, all the blades being brought together. The swords were then quickly withdrawn, flashing like sunbeams, and a four-square figure was presented, the dancers vaulting actively over each other's heads. Other variations succeeded, not necessary to be specified, and the sport concluded by a general clashing of swords, intended to represent a melee. Meanwhile, Nicholas had been joined by Richard Assheton, and the latter was not long in detecting the two devices through their disguises. On making this discovery, he mentioned it to the squire, and was surprised to find him already aware of the circumstance, and not less astonished when he was advised to let them alone, the squire adding that he was unable at that time to give his reasons for such counsel, but being good and conclusive, Richard would be satisfied of their propriety hereafter. The young man, however, thought otherwise, and, notwithstanding his relative's attempt to dissuade him, announced his intention of causing the parties to be arrested at once, and with this design he went in search of an officer of the guard, that the capture might be effected without disturbance. But the throng was so close round the dance that he could not pierce it, and being compelled to return and take another course, he got nearer to the mazy ring, and was unceremoniously pushed aside by the mummers. At this moment both his arms were forcibly grasped, and a deep voice on the right whispered in his ear, "Meddle not with us, and we will not meddle with you," while similar counsel was given him in other equally menacing tones, though in a different key, on his left. Richard would have shaken off his assailants and seized them in his turn, but power to do so was wanting to him. For the moment he was deprived of speech and motion, but whilst thus situated, he felt that the sapphire ring given him by the king was snatched from his finger by the first speaker, whom he knew to be Jem Device, while a fearful spell was muttered over him by Elizabeth. As this occurred at the time when the rattling of the swords engaged the whole attention of the spectators, no one noticed what was going forward except Nicholas, and before he could get up to the young man, the two miscreants were gone, nor could any one tell what had become of them. "Have the wretches done you a mischief?" asked the squire in a low tone of Richard. "They have stolen the king's ring, which I meant to use on Alison's behalf," replied the young man, who by this time had recovered his speech. "That's unlucky indeed," said Nicholas, "but we can defeat any ill design they may intend by acquainting Sir John Finett with the circumstance." "Let them be," said a voice in his ear. "The time is not yet come." The squire did not look round, for he well knew that the caution proceeded from Nance Redferne, and accordingly he observed to Richard, "Tarry a while, and you'll be amply avenged." And with this assurance the young man was fain to be content. Just then a trumpet was sounded, and a herald stationed on the summit of the broad flight of steps leading to the great hall proclaimed in a loud voice that a tilting match was about to take place between Archie Armstrong, jester to his most gracious Majesty, and Davy Droman, who filled the same honourable office to his Grace the Duke of Buckingham, and that a pair of gilt-heeled chopins would be the reward of the successful combatant. This announcement was received with cheers, and preparations were instantly made for the mock tourney. A large circle being formed by the yeomen of the guard, with an alley leading to it on either side, the two combatants, mounted on gaudy caparisoned hobby horses, rode into the ring. Both were armed to the teeth, each having a dish cover braced around him in lieu of a breastplate, a newly scoured brass porringer on his head, a large pewter platter instead of a buckler, and a spit with a bung on the point to prevent mischief in place of a lance. The Duke's jester was an obese little fellow, and his appearance in this warlike gear was so eminently ridiculous that it provoked roars of laughter, while Archie was scarcely less ridiculous. After curvetting round the arena in imitation of knights of chivalry, and performing their careers, their prankers, their false trots, their smooth ambles, and Canterbury paces, the two champions took up a position opposite each other, with difficulty, as it seemed, reining in their pawing charges, and awaited the signal of attack to be given by Sir John Finett, the judge of the tournament. This was not long delayed, and the laissez-aller being pronounced, the preux chevaliers started forward with so much fury and so little discretion, that meeting half-way with a tremendous shock, and butting against each other like two rams, both were thrown violently backwards, exhibiting amid the shouts of all the spectators their heels, no longer hidden by the trappings of their steeds, kicking in the air. Encumbered as they were, some little time elapsed before they could regain their feet, and their lances having been removed in the meantime, by order of Sir John Finett, as being weapons of too dangerous a description for such truculent combatants, they attacked each other with their broad leathern daggers, dealing sounding blows upon helm, halberdion, and shield, but doing little personal mischief. The strife raged furiously for some time, and as the champions appeared pretty well matched, it was not easy to say how it would terminate, when chance seemed to decide in favour of Davy Droman, for in dealing a heavier blow than usual, Archie's dagger snapped in twain, leaving him at the mercy of his opponent. On this, the doughty Davy, crowing lustily like a chanticleer, called upon him to yield. But Archie was so wroth at his misadventure, that instead of complying he sprang forward, and with the hilt of his broken weapon dealt his elated opponent a severe blow on the side of the head, not only knocking off the porringer, but stretching him on the ground beside it. The punishment he had received was enough for poor Davy. He made no attempt to rise, and Archie, crowing in his turn, trampling on the body of his prostrate foe, and then capering joyously around it, was declared the victor, and received the gilt chopines from the judge, amidst the laughter and acclamations of the beholders. With this the public sports concluded, and as evening was drawing on apace, such of the guests as were not invited to pass the night within the tower took their departure, while shortly afterwards, supper being served in the banqueting hall, on a scale of profusion and magnificence quite equal to the earlier repast, the king and the whole of his train sat down to it. End of chapter 9. Book 3, Chapter 10 of The Lancashire Witches. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Andy Minter. The Lancashire Witches, A Romance of Pendle Forest, by William Harrison Ainsworth. Book 3, Houghton Tower. Chapter 10, Evening Entertainments. Other amusements were reserved for the evening. While revelry was again held in the great hall, while the tables groaned for the third time since morning with good cheer, and the ruby wine, which seemed to gush from inexhaustible fountains, mantled in the silver flagons, while seneschal, sewer, and pantler, with the yeomen of the buttery in the kitchen, were again actively engaged in their vocations, while of the 300 guests more than half, as if insentiate, again vied with each other in prowess with the trencher and the goblet, while, in the words of old Taylor, the water poet, but who was no water drinker, and who thus sang of the hospitality of the men of Manchester in the early part of the 17th century. They had roast, boiled, baked, too much, white, claret, sack, nothing they thought too heavy or too hot, can followed can, and pot succeeded pot. During this time, preparations were made for fresh entertainments out of doors. The gardens at Houghton Tower, though necessarily confined in space owing to their situation on the brow of a hill, were beautifully laid out, and commanded from their ballasted terraces magnificent views of the surrounding country. Below them lay the well-wooded park, skirted by the silvery Darwen, with the fair village of Waltonley Dale immediately beyond it, the proud town of Preston farther on, and the single-coned Nose Point rising majestically in the distance. The principal garden constituted a square, and was divided, with mathematical precision, according to the formal taste of the time, into smaller squares, with a broad, well-kept gravel walk at each angle. These plots were arranged in various figures and devices, such as the cinquefoil, the flower de luce, the trefoil, the lozenge, the fret, the diamond, the crossbow, and the oval, all very elaborate and intricate in design. Besides these knots, as they were termed, there were labyrinths, and clipped yew-tree walks, and that indispensable requisite to a garden at the period, a maze. In the centre was a grassy eminence, surmounted by a pavilion, in front of which spread a grass plot of smoothest turf, ordinarily used as a bowling green. At the lower end of this a temporary stage was erected for the Masque about to be represented before the king. Torches were kindled, and numerous lamps burned in the branches of the adjoining trees, but they were scarcely needed, for the moon being at the full, the glorious effulgence shed by her upon the scene rendered all other light pale and ineffectual. After supper, at which the drinking was deeper than at dinner, the whole of the revellers repaired to the garden, full of frolic and merriment, and well disposed for any diversion in store for them. The king was conducted to the bowling green by his host, preceded by a crowd of attendants bearing odoriferous torches, but the royal gait being somewhat unsteady, the aid of Sir Gilbert Houghton's arm was required to keep the monarch from stumbling. The rest of the bacchanalians followed, and slated as they were, it will not be wondered that they put very little restraint upon themselves, but shouted, sang, danced, and indulged in all sorts of licence. Opposite the stage prepared for the maskers, a platform had been reared, in front of which was a chair for the king, with seats for the nobles and principal guests behind it. The sides were hung with curtains of crimson velvet fringed with gold, the roof decorated like a canopy, so that it had a very magnificent effect. James lolled back in his chair, and jested loudly and rather indecorously with the various personages as they took their places around him. In less than 5 minutes the whole of the green was filled with revellers, and great was the pushing and jostling, the laughing and screaming, that ensued among them. Silence was then enjoined by Sir John Finett, who had stationed himself on the steps of the stage, and at this command the assemblage became comparatively quiet, though now and then a half-suppressed titter or a smothered scream would break out. Amid this silence the king's voice could be distinctly heard, and his coarse jests reached the ears of the astonished audience, provoking many a severe comment from the elders, and much secret laughter from the juniors. The masque began. 2 tutelar deities appeared on the stage. They were followed by a band of foresters, clad in Lincoln green, with bows at their backs. The first deity wore a white linen tunic, with flesh-coloured hose and red buskins, and had a purple taffeta mantle over his shoulders. In his hand he held a palm branch, and a garland of the same leaves was woven round his brow. The second household god was a big brawny varlet, wild and shaggy in appearance, being clothed in the skins of beasts, with sandals of untanned cowhide. On his head was a garland of oak leaves, and from his neck hung a horn. He was armed with a hunting spear and a wood knife, and attended by a large Lancashire mastiff. Advancing to the front of the stage, the foremost personage thus addressed the monarch. "This day, great king, for government admired, which these thy subjects have so much desired, shall be kept holy in their hearts' best treasures, and vowed to James, as is this month to Caesar. And now the landlord of this ancient tower, thrice fortunate to see this happy hour, whose trembling heart thy presence sets on fire, unto this house the heart of all our shire, does bid thee cordial welcome, and would speak it in higher notes, but extreme joy doth break it. He makes his guests most welcome. In his eyes love tears do sit, not he that shouts and cries. And we, the antique guardians of this place, I of this house, he of the fruitful chase, since the bold Houghtons from the hill took name, who with the stiff unbridled Saxons came, and so have flourished in this fairer clime, successively from that to this our time, still offering up our immortal powers, sweet incense, wine, and odoriferous flowers.
while sacred Vesta in her virgin tire, with vows and wishes tends to hallowed fire. Now seeing that thy majesty is thus greater than household deities like us, we render up to thy most powerful guard this tower. This knight is thine, he is thy ward. For by thy helping and auspicious hand, he and his home shall ever, ever stand, and flourish in despite of envious fate, and then live like Augustus fortunate. And long, long mayst thou live, to which both men and guardian angels cry, Amen, Amen. James, who had demeaned himself critically during the delivery of the address, observed at its close to Sir Richard Houghton, who was standing immediately behind his chair, We cannot say mickle for the rhymes, which are but indifferently strung together, but the sentiments are real and good, and that is all we care for." On this, the second tutelar divinity advanced, and throwing himself into an attitude, as if bewildered by the august presence in which he stood, exclaimed, "Thou greatest of mortals!" and then stopped, as if utterly confounded. The king looked at him for a moment, and then roared out, "Well, good man, your commencement is pertinent and true enough, and though we be the greatest of mortals, as ye style us, dinna fash yourself about our grandeur, but go on, as if we were nae better nor wiser than your ain simple self." But instead of encouraging the dumbfounded deity, this speech completely upset him. He hastily retreated, and in trying to screen himself behind the huntsman, fell back from the stage, and his hound leapt after him. The incident, whether premeditated or not, amused the spectators much more than any speech he could have delivered, and the king joined heartily in the merriment. Silence being again restored, the first divinity came forward once more, and spoke thus: "Dread lord, thy majesty hath stricken dumb his weaker godhead. If to himself he come, unto thy servant straight he will commend these foresters, and charge them to attend thy pleasure in this park, and show such sport to the chief huntsman and thy princely court, as the small circle of this round affords, and be more ready than he was in words." Note: these speeches, given by Nichols, are derived from the family records of Sir Henry Philip Houghton, Baronet, and were actually delivered at a masque representing an occasion of King James's visit to Houghton Tower. End of note.
"Weel spoken, and to the purpose, good fellow," cried James, "and we take this opportunity of assuring our worthy host, in the presence of his other guests, that we have never had better sport in park or forest than we have this day enjoyed, have never eaten better cheer, nor quaffed better wine than at his board, and altogether have never been more hospitably welcomed."
Sir Richard was overwhelmed by his Majesty's commendation.
"I have done nothing, my gracious liege," he said, "to merit such acknowledgment on your part, and the delight I experience is only tempered by my utter unworthiness."
"Hoot toot, man," replied James jocularly, "ye merit a vast deal mair than we ha' said to ye, but good folk dinna always get their deserts. Ye ken that, Sir Richard. And now, hae ye not some other drolleries in store for us?"
The baronet replied in the affirmative, and soon afterwards the stage was occupied by a new class of performers, and a drollery commenced which kept the audience in one continual roar of laughter so long as it lasted. And yet none of these parts had been studied, the actors entirely trusting to their own powers of comedy to carry it out. The principal character was the Cap Justice, enacted by Sir John Finett, who took occasion in the course of the performance to lampoon and satirise most of the eminent legal characters of the day, mimicking the voice and manners of the three justices, Crook, Houghton, and Doddridge, so admirably that his hearers were well nigh convulsed, and the three learned gentlemen, who sat near the king,
though fully conscious of the ridicule applied to them, were obliged to laugh with the rest. But the unsparing satirist was not content with this, but went on with most of the other attendants upon the king, and being intimately versed in court scandal, he directed his lash with telling effect. As a contrast to the malicious pleasantry of the cap justice were the gambols and jests of Robin Goodfellow, a merry imp who, if he had put people into mischief, was always ready to get them out of it. Then there was a dance by Bill Huckler, Old Crambo, and Tom a Bedlam, the half-crazed individual already mentioned as being among the crowd in the base court. This was applauded to the echo, and consequently repeated. But the most diverting scene of all was that in which Jem Tosspot and the 3 Doll Wangos appeared. Though given in the broadest vernacular of the county, and scarcely intelligible to the whole of the company, the dialogue of this part of the piece was so lifelike and natural that every one recognised its truth, while the situations, arranged with the slightest effort and on the spur of the moment, were extremely ludicrous. The scene was supposed to take place in a small Lancashire alehouse, where a jovial pedlar was carousing, and where, being visited by his 3 sweethearts, each of whom he privately declared to be the favourite, he had to reconcile their differences, and keep them all in good humour. Familiar with the character in all its aspects, Nicholas played it to the life, and to do them justice, Dames Baldwin, Tetlow, and Nance Redfern were but little, if at all, inferior to him. There was a reality in their jealous quarrelling that gave infinite zest to the performance. "Soul of my body!" exclaimed James, admiringly. "Those are 3 braw women. Any on 'em mun be 6 feet if she's an inch, and weel made and well favoured too. Zounds, Sir Richard, there's nae standing the spells of your Lancashire witches. High born and low born, they are alike. I would their only witchcraft lay in their een. I should then hae the less fear on 'em. But have you aught mair? For it's growing late, and we ken we have something to do in that pavilion." "Only a merry dance, my liege, in which a man will appear in a dendrological foliage of fronds," replied the baronet. James laughed at the description, and soon afterwards a party of mummers, male and female, clad in various grotesque garbs, appeared on the stage. In the midst of them was the dendrological man, enclosed in a framework of green boughs, like that borne by a modern Jack-in-the-Green. A ring was formed by the mummers, and the round commenced to lively music. While the mazy measure was proceeding, Nance Redfern, who had quitted the stage with Nicholas, and now stood close to him among the spectators, said in a low voice, "Look there." The squire glanced in the direction indicated, and to his surprise and terror discerned among the crowd at a little distance the figure of a Cistercian monk. "He's invisible to every eye except our own," whispered Nance, "and he's come to tell me it is time." "Time for what?" demanded Nicholas. "Time for you to seize them 2 accursed devices, Jem and his mother," replied Nance. "They're both on young boards. Jem is the man in the tree, and Elizabeth is the old crone in the red kirtle and high crowned hat. You will know of her face when you pluck off her mask." "The monk is gone," cried Nicholas. "I've kept my eyes steadily fixed on him, and he's melted into air. What has he to do with the devices?" "He is their fate," returned Nance, "and I are acting under his orders. So mount and seize them. I will go with you." Forcing his way through the crowd, Nicholas ran up the steps, and, followed by Nance, sprang upon the stage. His appearance occasioned considerable surprise, but as he was recognised by the spectators as the jolly Jem Tosspot, who had so recently diverted them, and his companion as one of the 3 Doll Wangos, in anticipation of some more fun, they received him with a round of applause. But without stopping to acknowledge it, or being for a moment diverted from his purpose, Nicholas seized the old crone, and, consigning her to Nance, caught hold of the leafy frame in which the man was encased, and pulled him from under it. But he began to think that he had unkennelled the wrong fox, for the man, though a tall fellow, bore no resemblance to Jem Device, while, when the crone's mask was plucked off, she was found to be a comely young woman. Meanwhile, all around was in an uproar, and amidst a hurricane of hisses, yells, and other indications of displeasure from the spectators, several of the mummers demanded the meaning of such a strange and unwarrantable proceeding. "They are a couple of witches," cried Nicholas. "This is Jem Device and his mother Elizabeth." "My name is neither Jem nor Device," cried the man. "Nor mine Elizabeth," screamed the woman. "We know the Devices," cried two or three voices, "and these are none of them." Nicholas was perplexed. The storm increased, threats accompanied the hisses, when luckily he espied a ring on the man's finger. He instantly seized his hand and held it up to the general gaze. "A proof! A proof!" he cried. "This sapphire ring was given by the king to my cousin Richard Assheton this morning, and stolen from him by Jem Device." "Examine their features again," said Nance Redferne, waving her hands over them. "You will all know them now." The woman's face instantly altered, many years being added to it in a breath. The man changed equally. The utmost astonishment was evinced by all at the transformation, and the bystanders who had spoken before now cried out loudly, "We know them perfectly now. They are the two Devices." By this time an officer, attended by a party of halberdiers, had mounted the boards, and the two prisoners were delivered to their custody by Nicholas. "Hold!" cried the man. "I will no longer deny my name. I am Jem Device, and this is my mother Elizabeth. But a worse offender than either on us stands before you. This woman is Nance Redferne, granddaughter of the old hag, Mother Chattox. I charge her with making wax images and sticking pins in them with intent to kill folk. Her would have killed me myself with her devilry if I hadn't been too strong for her. And that's why her bears me malice and has betrayed me to Squire Nicholas Assheton. Seize her and call me as a witness again her." And as Nance was secured, he laughed malignantly. "I care not," replied Nance. "I am now revenged on you both." While this impromptu performance took place, as much to the surprise of James as any one else, and while he was desiring Sir Richard Houghton to ascertain what it all meant, at the very moment that the two Devices and Nance removed from the stage, an usher approached the monarch, and said that Master Potts entreated a moment's audience of his Majesty. "Potts!" exclaimed James, somewhat confused. "Why is he?" "Ah, yeah, I recollect. A witch finder. Well, let him approach." Accordingly, the next moment, the little attorney, whose face was evidently charged with some tremendous intelligence, was ushered into the king's presence. After a profound reverence, he said, "May it please your Majesty, I have something for your private ear." "Well, then," replied James, "approach us more closely. What you got to say, sir? What more agin these witches?" "A great deal, sire," said Potts, in an impressive tone. "Something dreadful has happened. Something terrible." "Eh? What?" exclaimed James, looking alarmed. "What is it, man? Speak." "Murder, sire. Murder has been done," said Potts, in low, thrilling accents. "Murder!" exclaimed James, horror-stricken. "Tell us all about it, and without more ado." But Potts was still circumspect. With an air of deepest mystery, he approached his head as near as he dared to that of the monarch, and whispered in his ear. "Can this be true?" cried James. "If so, it's very shocking, very sad." "It is too true, as your Majesty will find on investigation," replied Potts. "The little girl I told you of, Jennet Device, saw it done." "Well, there's no accounting for human frailty and wickedness," said James. "Let all necessary steps be taken at once. We will consider what to do. But, do you hear, sir? Dinna let the bairn Jennet go. Hold her fast. Do you mind that? Now go and cause the guilty party to be put under arrest." And on receiving this command, Master Potts departed.
Scarcely was he gone than Nicholas Assheton came up to the railing of the platform, and, imploring his Majesty's forgiveness for the disturbance he had occasioned, explained that it had been owing to the seizure of the two Devices, who, for some wicked but unexplained purpose, had contrived to introduce themselves, under various disguises, into the tower.
"You did right to arrest the miscreants, sir. But have ye heard what has happened?"
"No, my liege," replied Nicholas, alarmed by the king's manner. "What is it?"
"Come nearer, and ye shall learn, for we wouldna hae it bruited about, though, if true, as we canna doubt, it will be known soon enough."
And as the squire bent forward, he imparted some intelligence to him, which instantly changed the expression of the latter to one of mingled horror and rage.
"It is false, sire," he cried. "I will answer for her innocence with my life. She could not do it. Your Majesty's patience is abused. It is Jennet who has done it, not she. But I will unravel the terrible mystery. You have the other two wretches prisoners, and can enforce the truth from them." "We will essay to do so," replied James. "But we have also another prisoner."
"Christopher Demdike?" said Nicholas.
"Ay, Christopher Demdike," rejoined James. "But another besides him. Mistress Nutter. You stare, sir, but it is true. She is in yonder pavilion. We ken full well who assisted her flight and who concealed her. Master Potts has told us all. It is well for you that your poor kinsman Richard Assheton did us such good service at the boar hunt to-day. We shall not now be unmindful of it, even though he cannot send us the ring we gave him."
"It is here, sire," replied Nicholas. "It was stolen from him by the villain Jem Device. The poor youth meant to use it for Alizon. I now deliver it to your Majesty, as coming from him in her behalf."
"And we say receive it,"
replied the monarch, brushing away the moisture that gathered thickly in his eyes. At this moment, a tall personage, wrapped in a cloak, who appeared to be an officer of the guard, approached the railing.
"I am come to inform your Majesty that Christopher Demdike has just died of his wounds," said this personage.
"And say he's had a stray death after all," rejoined James. "Well, we are sorry for it."
"His portion will be eternal bail," observed the officer.
"How knew you that, sir?" demanded the king, sharply. "You're not his judge."
"I witnessed his end, sire," replied the officer, "and no man who died as he died can be saved. The fiend was beside him at his death throes."
"Save us!" exclaimed James. "Ye dinna say so. God sent it, man, but this is gruesome, and gaes the flesh creep on one's banes. Let his foul carcass be ta'en away, and hang it on a gibbet on the hill where Malkin Tower since stood, as a warning to all such heinous offenders." As the king ceased speaking, Master Potts appeared, out of breath and greatly excited. "She has escaped, sire," he cried. "Oh, Jennet!" exclaimed James. "If sae, we'll hang you in her stead." "No, sire." "Alizon," replied Potts. "I can nowhere find her now," and he hesitated. "Well, it's nae great matter," replied James, as if relieved, and with a glance of satisfaction at Nicholas.
"I know where Alizon is, sire," said the officer.
"Indeed!" exclaimed James. "This fellow is strangely officious," he muttered to himself. "And where may she be, sir?" he added aloud.
"I will produce her within a quarter of an hour in yonder pavilion," replied the officer, "and all that Master Potts has been unable to find."
"Your Majesty may trust him," observed Nicholas, who had attentively regarded the officer. "Depend upon it, he will make good his words." "You think so?" cried the king. "Then we'll put him to the test. You will engage to confront Alizon with her mother," he added to the officer.
"I will, sire," replied the other, "but I shall require the assistance of a dozen men."
"Take 20 if you will," replied the king. "I'm impatient to see what she can do."
"In a quarter of an hour all shall be ready within the pavilion, sire," replied the officer. "You have seen one masked knight, but you shall now behold a different one. The mask of death." And he disappeared. Nicholas felt sure he would accomplish his task, for he had recognised in him the Cistercian monk. "Where is Sir Richard Assheton of Middleton?" inquired the king. "He left the Tower with his daughter Dorothy immediately after the banquet," replied Nicholas. "I am glad of it, right glad," replied the monarch. "The terrible intelligence can be the better broken to them. If it had come upon them suddenly, it might have been fatal, especially to the poor lassie. Let Sir Ralph Assheton of Whalley come to me, and Master Richard Nowell of Read." "Your Majesty shall be obeyed," replied Richard Houghton. The king then gave some instructions respecting the prisoners, and bade Master Potts have Jennet in readiness. And now to see what terrible thing had happened. End of chapter 10. Book 3.
Chapter 11.
Of the Lancashire Witches. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Andy Minter. The Lancashire Witches. A Romance of Pendle Forest. By William Harrison Ainsworth. Book 3. Houghton Tower.
Chapter 11. Fatality. Along the eastern terrace, a youth and maiden were pacing slowly. They had stolen forth unperceived from the revel, and passing through a door standing invitingly open, had entered the garden. Though overjoyed in each other's presence, the solemn beauty of the night, so powerful in its contrast to the riotous scenes they had just quitted, profoundly impressed them. Above were the deep serene heavens, lighted up by the starry host and their radiant queen. Below, the immemorial woods, steeped in silvery mists, arising from the stream flowing past them. All nature was hushed in holy rest. In opposition to the flood of soft light emanating from the lovely planet overhead, and which turned all it fell on, whether tree or tower or stream, to beauty, was the artificial glare caused by the torches near the pavilion, while the discordant sounds occasioned by the minstrels tuning their instruments disturbed the repose. As they went on, however, these sounds were lost in the distance, and the glare of the torches was excluded by intervening trees. Then the moon looked down lovingly upon them, and the only music that reached their ears arose from the nightingales. After a pause they walked on again, hand in hand, gazing at each other, at the glorious heavens, and drinking in the thrilling melody of the songsters of the grove. At the angle of the terrace was a small arbour, placed in the midst of a bosquet, and they sat down within it. Then, and not till then, did their thoughts find vent in words. Forgetting the sorrows they had endured, and the perils by which they were environed, they found in their deep mutual love a shield against the sharpest arrows of fate. In low, gentle accents they breathed their passion, solemnly plighting their faith before all-seeing heaven. Poor souls, they were happy then, intensely happy. Alas, that their happiness should be so short, for those few moments of bliss, stolen from a waste of tears, were all that was allowed them. Inexorable fate still dogged their footsteps. Amid the bosquet stood a listener to their converse, a little girl, with high shoulders and sharp features on which diabolical malice was stamped. 2 yellow eyes glistened through the leaves beside her, marking the presence of a cat. As the lovers breathed their vows, and indulged in hopes never to be realized, the wicked child grinned, clenched her hands, and, grudging them their short-lived happiness, seemed inclined to interrupt it. Some stronger motive, however, kept her quiet. What are the pair talking of now? She hears her own name mentioned by the maiden, who speaks of her with pity, almost with affection, pardons her for the mischief she has done her, and hopes heaven will pardon her likewise. But she knows not the full extent of the girl's malignity,
or even her gentle heart must have been roused to resentment. The little girl, however, feels no compunction. Infernal malice has taken possession of her heart, and crushed every kindly feeling within it. She hates all those that compassionate her, and returns evil for good. What are the lovers talking of now? Of their first meeting at Whalley Abbey, when one was May Queen, and by her beauty and simplicity won the other's heart, losing her own at the same time. A bright, unclouded career seemed to lie before them then. Woefully had it darkened since. Alas, alas! The little girl smiles. She hopes they will go on. She likes to hear them talk thus. Past happiness is ever remembered with a pang by the wretched, and they were happy then. Go on, go on. But they are silent for a while, for they wish to dwell on that hopeful, that blissful season, and a nightingale, alighting on a bough above them, pours forth its sweet plaint, as if in response to their tender emotions. They praise the bird's song, and it suddenly ceases, for the little girl, full of malevolence, stretches forth her hand, and it drops to the ground as if stricken by a dart. "Is thy heart broken, poor bird?" exclaimed the young man, taking up the hapless songster, yet warm and palpitating. "To die in the midst of thy song, it is hard." "Very hard," replied the maiden tearfully. "Its fate seems a type of our own." The little girl laughed, but in a low tone and to herself. The pair then grew sad. This slight incident had touched them deeply, and their conversation took on a melancholy turn. They spoke of the blights that had nipped their love in the bud, of the canker that had eaten into its heart, of the destiny that so relentlessly pursued them, threatening to separate them for ever. The little girl laughed merrily. Then they spoke of the grave, and of hope beyond the grave, and they spoke cheerfully. The little girl could laugh no longer, for with her all beyond the grave was despair. After that they spoke of the terrible power that Satan had lately obtained in that unhappy district, of the arts he had employed, and of the votaries he had won. Both prayed fervently that his snares might be circumvented, and his rule destroyed. During this part of the discourse, the cat swelled to the size of a tiger, and his eyes glared like fiery coals. He made a motion as if he would spring forward, but the voice of prayer arrested him, and he shrank back to his former size. "Poor Jennet is ensnared by the fiend," murmured the maiden, "and will perish eternally. Would I could save her!" "It cannot be," replied the young man. "She is beyond redemption." The little girl gnashed her teeth with rage. "But my mother, I do not now despair of her," said Alizon. "She has broken the bondage by which she was enchained, and if she resists temptation to the last, I am assured will be saved." "Heaven aid her!" exclaimed Richard. Scarcely were the words uttered than the cat disappeared. "Why, Tib! Where are you, Tib? I want you!" cried the little girl, in a low tone. But the familiar did not respond to the call. "Where can he have gone?" cried Jennet. "Tib! Tib!" Still the cat came not. "Then I mun do the work without him," pursued the little girl, "and I will no longer delay it." And with this she crept steadily round the arbour, and, approaching the side where Richard sat, watched an opportunity of touching him unperceived. As her finger came in contact with his frame, a pang like death shot through his heart, and he fell upon Alizon's shoulder. "Are you ill?" she exclaimed, gazing at his pallid features, rendered ghastly white by the moonlight. Richard could make no reply, and Alizon, becoming dreadfully alarmed, was about to fly for assistance, but the young man, by a great effort, detained her. "I mun now run and tell Mester Potts who may be found wi' him," muttered Jennet, creeping away. Just then Richard recovered his speech, but his words were faintly uttered, and with difficulty. "Alizon," he said,
I will not attempt to disguise my condition from you. I am dying, and my death will be attributed to you. For evil-minded persons have persuaded the king that you have bewitched me, and he will believe the charge now. Oh, if you would ease the pangs of death for me, if you would console my latest movements, leave me, and quit this place before it be too late. Oh, Richard, she cried distractedly, you ask more than I can perform. If you are indeed in such imminent danger, I will stay with you, will die with you. No, live for me, live. Save yourself, Alison, implored the young man. Your danger is greater than mine. A dreadful death awaits you at the stake. Oh, mercy, mercy, heaven, spare her. In pity, spare her. Have we not suffered enough? I can no more. Farewell for ever, Alison. One kiss, the last. And as their lips met, his strength utterly forsook him, and he fell backwards. One grave, he murmured. One grave, Alison. And so, without a groan, he expired. Alison neither screamed nor swooned, but remained in a state of stupefaction, gazing at the body. As the moon fell upon the placid features, they looked as if locked in slumber. There he lay, the young, the brave, the beautiful, the loving, the beloved. Fate had triumphed. Death had done his work, but he had only performed half his task. One grave, it was his last wish, it shall be so, she cried in frenzied tones. I shall thus escape my enemies, and avoid the horrible and shameful death to which they would doom me. And she snatched the dagger from the ill-fated youth's side. Now, fate, I defy thee, she cried with a fearful laugh. One last look at that calm, beautiful face, one kiss of the cold lips which can no more return the endearment, and the dagger is pointed at her breast. But she is withheld by an arm of iron, and the weapon falls from her grasp. She looks up. A tall figure, clothed in the mouldering habiliments of a Cistercian monk, stands beside her. She knows the vestments at once, for she has seen them before, hanging up in the closet adjoining her mother's chamber at Whalley Abbey, and the features of the ghostly monk seem familiar to her.
"Raise not thy hand against thyself," said the phantom in a tone of awful reproof. "It is the fiend prompts thee to do it. He would take advantage of thy misery to destroy thee."
"I took thee for the fiend," replied Alison, gazing at him with wonder rather than terror. "Who art thou?"
"The enemy of thy enemies, and therefore thy friend," replied the monk. "I would have saved thy lover if I could, but his destiny was not to be averted. But rest content, I will avenge him."
"I do not want vengeance. I want to be with him," she replied, frantically embracing the body.
"Thou wilt soon be with him," said the phantom, in tones of deep significance. "Arise, and come with me. Thy mother needs thy assistance."
"My mother!" exclaimed Alison, clearing the blinding tresses from her brow. "Where is she?"
"Follow me, and I will bring thee to her," said the monk.
"And leave him? I cannot," cried Alison, gazing wildly at the body.
"You must. A soul is at stake, and will perish if you come not," said the monk. "He is at rest, and you will speedily rejoin him."
"With that assurance I will go," replied Alison, with a last look at the object of her love. "One grave. Lay us in one grave."
"It shall be done according to your wish," said the monk,
and he glided on with noiseless footsteps. Alison followed him along the terrace. Presently they came to a dark yew-tree walk, leading to a labyrinth, and tracking it swiftly, as well as the overarched and intricate path to which it conducted, they entered a grotto, whence a flight of steps descended to a subterranean passage, hewn out of the rock. Along this passage, which was of some extent, the monk proceeded, and Alison followed him.
At last they came to another flight of steps, and here the monk stopped.
"We are now beneath the pavilion where you will find your mother," he said. "Mount. The way is clear before you. I have other work to do."
Alison obeyed, and as she advanced was surprised to find the monk gone. He had neither passed her nor ascended the steps, and must, therefore, have sunk into the earth. End of chapter 11. Book 3, Chapter 12, of The Lancashire Witches. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Andy Minter. The Lancashire Witches, A Romance of Pendle Forest, by William Harrison Ainsworth. Book 3, Houghton Tower. Chapter 12, The Last Hour. Within the pavilion sat Alice Nutter. She was clad in deep mourning, but her dress seemed disordered as if by hasty travel. Her looks were full of anguish and terror. Her blanched tresses, once so dark and beautiful, hung dishevelled over her shoulders, and her thin hands were clasped in supplication. Her cheeks were ashy pale, but on her brow was a bright red mark, as if traced by a finger dipped in blood. A lamp was burning on the table beside her. Near it was a skull, and near this emblem of mortality an hourglass running fast. The windows and doors of the building were closed, and it would seem the unhappy lady was a prisoner. She had been brought there secretly that night, with what intent she knew not, but she felt sure it was with no friendly design towards herself. Early in the day 3 horsemen had arrived at her retreat in Pendle Forest, and without making any charge against her, or explaining whither they meant to take her, or indeed answering any inquiry, had brought her off with them, and proceeding across the country, had arrived at a forester's hut on the outskirts of Houghton Park. Here they tarried till evening, placing her in a room by herself, and keeping strict watch over her. And when the shadows of night fell, they conveyed her through the woods, and by a private entrance to the gardens of the tower, and with equal secrecy to the pavilion, where, setting a lamp before her, they left her to her meditations. All refused to answer her inquiries, but one of them, with a sinister smile, placed the hourglass and skull beside her. Left alone, the wretched lady vainly sought some solution of the enigma, why she had been brought thither. She could not solve it, but she determined, if her capture had been made by any lawful authorities, to confess her guilt and submit to condign punishment. Though the window and doors were closed as before mentioned, sounds from without reached her, and she heard confused and tumultuous noises as if from a large assemblage. For what purpose were they met? Could it be for her execution? No, there were strains of music and bursts of laughter, and yet she had heard that the burning of a witch was a spectacle in which the populace delighted, that they looked upon it as a show like any other, and why should they not laugh and have music at it? But could she be executed without trial, without judgment? She knew not. All she knew was that she was guilty and deserved to die. But when the idea took possession of her, the laughter sounded in her ears like the yells of demons, and the strains like the fearful harmonies she had heard at weird Sabbaths. All at once she recollected, with indescribable terror, that on this very night the compact she had entered into with the fiend expired, that at midnight, unless by her penitence and prayers she had worked out her salvation, he could claim her. She recollected also, and with increased uneasiness, that the man who had set the hourglass on the table, and who had regarded her with a sinister smile as he did so, had said it was 11 o'clock. Her last hour, then, had arrived, nay, was partly spent, and the moments were passing swiftly by. The agony she endured at this thought was intense. She felt as if reason were forsaking her, and but for her determined efforts to resist it, such a crisis might have occurred. But she knew that her eternal welfare depended upon the preservation of her mental balance, and she strove to maintain it, and in the end succeeded. Her gaze was fixed intently on the hourglass. She saw the sand trickling silently but swiftly down, like a current of life-blood, which, when it ceased, life would cease with it. She saw the shining grains above insensibly diminishing in quantity, and, as if she could arrest her destiny by the act, she seized the glass and would have turned it. But the folly of the proceeding arrested her, and she set it down again. Then horrible thoughts came upon her, crushing her and overwhelming her, and she felt, by anticipation, all the torments she would speedily have to endure. Oceans of fire in which miserable souls were for ever tossing rolled before her. Yells such as no human anguish can produce smote her ears. Monsters of frightful form yawned to devour her. Fiends armed with terrible implements of torture, such as the wildest imagination cannot paint, menaced her. All hell and its horrors was there, its dreadful gulf, its roaring furnaces, its rivers of molten metal, ever burning, yet never consuming its victims. A hot, sulphurous atmosphere oppressed her, and a film of blood dimmed her sight. She endeavoured to pray, but her tongue clove to the roof of her mouth. She looked about her for her Bible, but it had been left behind when she was taken from her retreat. She had no safeguard, none. Still the sand ran on. New agonies assailed her. Hell was before her again, but in a new form and with new torments. She closed her eyes, she shut her ears, but she saw it still, and heard its terrific yells. Again she consults the hourglass. The sand is running on, ever diminishing. New torments assail her. She thinks of all she loved most on earth, of her daughter. Oh, if Alison were near her, she might pray for her, might scare away these frightful visions, might save her. She calls to her, but she answers not. No, she is utterly abandoned of God and man, and must perish eternally. Again she consults the hourglass. 1/4 of an hour is all that remains to her. Oh, that she could employ it in prayer! Oh, that she could kneel or even weep! A large mirror hangs against the wall, and she is drawn towards it by an irresistible impulse. She sees a figure within it, but she does not know herself. Can that cadaverous object with the white hair, that seems newly arisen from the grave, be she? It must be a phantom. No, she touches her cheek, and finds it is real. But what is this red brand upon her brow? It must be the seal of the demon. She tries to efface it, but it will not come out. On the contrary, it becomes redder and deeper. Again she consults the glass. The sand is still running on. How many minutes remain to her?
10,
cried a voice, replying to her mental inquiry.
10.
And turning, she perceived her familiar standing beside her.
Thy time is well nigh out, Alice Nutter,
he said.
In 10 minutes my lord will claim thee.
My compact with thy master is broken, she replied, summoning up all her resolution. I have long ceased to use the power bestowed upon me, but even if I had wished it, thou hast refused to serve me.
I have refused to serve you, madam, because you have disobeyed the express injunctions of my master,
replied the familiar.
But your apostasy does not free you from bondage. You have merely lost advantages which you might have enjoyed. If you chose to dismiss me, I could not help it. Neither I nor my lord have been to blame. We have performed our part of the contract.
Why am I brought hither? Demanded Mistress Nutter.
I will tell you, replied the familiar. You were brought here by order of the king. Your retreat was revealed to him by Master Potts, who learnt it from Jennet Device. The sapient sovereign intended to confront you with your daughter Alison, who, like yourself, is accused of witchcraft. But he will be disappointed, for when he comes for you, you will be out of his reach."
And he rubbed his hands at the jest.
"Alizon accused of witchcraft, sayest thou?" cried Mistress Nutter.
"Ay,"
replied the familiar.
"she is suspected of bewitching Richard Assheton, who has been done to death by Jennet Device. For one so young, the little girl has certainly a rare turn for mischief, but no one will know the real author of the crime, and Alizon will suffer for it."
"Heaven will not suffer such iniquity," said the lady.
"As you have nothing to do with heaven, madam, it is needless to refer to it," said the familiar. "But it is certainly rather hard that one so young as Alizon should perish."
"Can you save her?" asked Mistress Nutter.
"Oh, yes, I could save her, but she will not let me," replied the familiar with a grin.
No, no, it is impossible," cried the wretched woman, "and I cannot help her."
"Perhaps you might," observed the tempter. "My master, whom you accuse of harshness, is ever willing to oblige you. You have a few minutes left. Do you wish him to aid her? Command me, and I will obey you."
"This is some snare," thought Mistress Nutter. "I will resist it."
"You cannot be worse off than you are,"
remarked the familiar.
"I know not that," replied the lady. "What wouldst thou do?"
"Whatever you command me, madam. I can do nothing of my own accord. Shall I bring your daughter here? Say so, and it shall be done."
"No, thou wouldst ensnare me," she replied. "I well know that thou hast no power over her. Thou wouldst place some phantasm before me. I would see her, but not through thy agency." "She is here," cried Alizon, opening the door of a closet, and rushing towards her mother, who instantly locked her in her arms. "Pray for me, my child," cried Mistress Nutter, mastering her emotion, "or I shall be snatched from you for ever. My moments are numbered. Pray, pray."
Alizon fell on her knees and prayed fervently.
"You waste your breath," cried the familiar in a mocking tone. "Never till the brand shall disappear from your brow, and the writing traced in her blood shall vanish from this parchment, can she be saved. She is mine."
"Pray, Alizon, pray,"
shrieked Mistress Nutter.
"I will tear her in pieces if she does not cease,"
cried the familiar, assuming a terrible shape, and menacing her with claws like those of a wild beast.
"Pray thou, mother,"
cried Alizon.
"I cannot,"
replied the lady.
"I will kill her if she but makes the attempt,"
howled the demon.
"But try, mother, try,"
cried Alizon. The poor lady dropped on her knees, and raised her hands in humble supplication.
"Heaven forgive me!"
she exclaimed. The demon seized the hourglass.
"The sand is out. The term has expired. She is mine," he cried.
"Clasp thy arms tightly round me, my child. He cannot take me from thee,"
shrieked the agonised woman.
"Release her, Alizon, or I will slay thee likewise," roared the demon.
"Never," she replied. "Thou canst not overcome me. Ah," she added joyfully, "the brand has disappeared from her brow."
"And the writing from the parchment,"
howled the demon.
"but I will have her notwithstanding."
And he plunged his claws into Alice Nutter's flesh, but her daughter held her fast.
"Oh, hold me, my child! Hold me, or I am lost!" shrieked the lady.
"Be warned, and let her go, or thy life shall pay for hers,"
cried the demon.
"My life for hers willingly," replied Alizon.
Then take thy fate, rejoined the evil spirit,
and placing his hand upon her heart, it instantly ceased to beat. "Mother, thou art saved! Saved!" exclaimed Alizon, throwing out her arms. And gazing at her for an instant with a seraphic look, she fell backwards and expired.
"Thou art mine!"
roared the demon, seizing Mistress Nutter by the hair and dragging her from her daughter's body, to which she clung desperately. "Help! Help!" she cried.
"Thou mayst call, but thy cries will be unheeded," rejoined the familiar, with mocking laughter.
"Thou liest, false fiend," said Mistress Nutter. "Heaven will help me now." And as she spoke, the Cistercian monk stood before them.
"Hence,"
he cried with an imperious gesture to the demon.
"She is no longer in thy power. Hence."
And with a howl of rage and disappointment, the familiar vanished.
"Alice Nutter," continued the monk, "thy safety has been purchased at the price of thy daughter's life, but it is of little moment, for she could not live long. Her gentle heart was broken, and when the demon stopped it for ever, he performed unintentionally a merciful act. She must rest in the same grave with him she loved so well during life. This tell to those who will come to thee anon. Thou art delivered from the yoke of Satan. Full expiation has been made, but earthly justice must be satisfied. Thou must pay the penalty for crimes committed in the flesh, but what thou sufferest here shall avail thee hereafter."
"I am content," she replied.
"Pass the rest of thy life in penitence and prayer," pursued the monk, "and let nothing divert thee from it, for though free now, thou wilt be subject to evil influence and temptations to the last. Remember this."
"I will," she rejoined.
"And now," he said, "kneel beside thy daughter's body and pray. I will return to thee ere many minutes be past. One task more, and then my mission is ended."
End of chapter 12. Book 3, Chapter 13 of The Lancashire Witches. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Andy Minter. The Lancashire Witches, A Romance of Pendle Forest, by William Harrison Ainsworth. Book 3, Houghton Tower. Chapter 13. The Masque of Death. Short time as he had to wait, James was unable to control his impatience. At last he arose, and completely sobered by the recent strange events, descended the steps of the platform, and walked on without assistance. "Let the yeomen of the guard keep back the crowd," he said to an officer, "and let none follow me but Sir Ralph Assheton, Master Nicholas Assheton, and Master Roger Nowell. When I call, let the prisoners be brought forward." "Your Majesty shall be obeyed," replied the baronet, giving the necessary directions. James then moved slowly forward in the direction of the pavilion, and as he went, called Nicholas Assheton to him. "Who was that officer?" he asked. "Your pardon, my liege, but I cannot answer the question," replied Nicholas. "And why not, sir?" demanded the monarch, sharply. "For reasons which I will hereafter render to your Majesty, and which I am persuaded you will find satisfactory," rejoined the squire. "Weel, I dare say you're right," said the king. "But do you think he'll keep his word?" "I'm sure of it," returned Nicholas. "The time is come, then," exclaimed James impatiently, and looking up at the pavilion. "The time is come," echoed a sepulchral voice. "Did you speak?" inquired the monarch. "No, sire," replied Nicholas.
But someone seems to give you intimation that all is ready. Will it please you to go on?"
"Enter," cried the voice.
"Who speaks?" demanded the king. And as no answer was returned, he continued, "I will not set foot in the structure. It may be a snare of Satan." At this moment, the shutters of the window flew open, showing that the pavilion was lighted up by many tapers within, while solemn strains of music issued from it.
"Enter,"
repeated the voice. "Have no fear, sire," said Nicholas. "That cannot be the work of the demon," cried James. "He does not delight in holy hymns and sweet music." "That is a solemn dirge for the dead," observed Nicholas, as melodious voices mingled with the music. We'll go on at our hazards," said James. The doors flew open as the king and his attendants approached, and as soon as they passed through them, the valves swung back to their places. A strange, sad spectacle met their gaze. In the midst of the chamber stood a bier, covered with a velvet pall, and on it the bodies of a youth and maiden were deposited. Pale and beautiful were they as sculptured marble, and a smile sat upon their features. Side by side they were lying, with their arms enfolded, as if they had died in each other's embrace. A wreath of yew and cypress was placed above their heads, and flowers were scattered round them. They were Richard and Alison. It was a deeply touching sight, and for some time none spoke. The solemn dirge continued, interrupted only by the stifled sobs of the listeners.
"Both gone!" exclaimed Nicholas, in accents broken by emotion. "And so young, so good, so beautiful! Alas, alas!"
"She could not have bewitched him," said the king.
Alison was all purity and goodness," cried Nicholas, "and is now numbered with the angels."
"The guilty one is in thy hands, O king," said the voice. "It is for thee to punish."
"And I will not hold my hand," said James. "The devices shall assuredly perish. When I go from this chamber, I will have them conveyed under strong escort to Lancaster Castle. They shall die by the hands of the common executioner."
"My mission, then, is complete," replied the voice. "I can rest in peace."
"Who art thou?" demanded the king.
"One who sinned deeply, but is now pardoned," replied the voice.
The king was for a moment lost in reflection, and then turned to depart. At this moment a kneeling figure, whom no one had hitherto noticed, arose from behind the bier. It was a lady, robed in mourning. So ghastly pale were her features, and so skeleton-like her attenuated frame, that James thought he beheld a spectre, and recoiled in terror. The figure advanced slowly towards him.
"Who and what art thou, in heaven's name?" he exclaimed. "I am Alice Nutter, sire," replied the lady, prostrating herself before him. "Alice Nutter, the witch!" cried the king. "Why, I recollect thou wert here. I sent for thee, but recent terrible events had put thee clean out of my head. But expect no grace from me, evil woman. I will show thee none." "I ask none, sire," replied the penitent. "I came to place myself in your hands, that justice may be done upon me." "Ah!" exclaimed James. "Dost thou indeed repent thee of thy iniquities? Dost thou abjure the devil and all his works?" "I do," replied the lady fervently. "My compact with the evil one has been broken by the prayers of my devoted daughter, who sacrificed herself for me, and thereby saved my soul alive. But human justice requires an expiation, and I am anxious to make it." "Arise, ill-fated woman," said the king, much moved. "You must go to Lancaster, but in consideration of your penitence no indignity shall be shown you. You must be strictly guarded, but you shall not be taken with the other prisoners." "I humbly thank your majesty," replied the lady. "May I take a last farewell of my child?" "Do so,"
replied James. Alice Nutter then approached the bier, and after gazing for a moment with deepest fondness upon the features of her daughter, imprinted a kiss upon her marble brow. In doing this, her tears fell fast. "You can weep, I see," observed the king. "You are a witch no longer." "Ay, heaven be praised, I can weep," she replied, "and so ease my overburdened heart. Oh, sire, none but those who have experienced it can tell the agony of being denied this relief of nature. Farewell for ever, my blessed child," she exclaimed, kissing her brow again, "and you too, her beloved. Nicholas Assheton, it was her wish to be buried in the same grave with Richard. You will see it done, Nicholas?" I will," replied the squire, in a voice of deepest emotion. "And I likewise promise it," said Sir Ralph Assheton. "They shall rest together in Whalley churchyard. It is well that Sir Richard and Dorothy are gone," he observed to Nicholas. "It is indeed," said the squire. "Or we should have had another funeral to perform. Pray heaven it be not so now." "Have you any other request to prefer?" demanded the king. "None whatever, sire," replied the lady, "except that I wish to make full restitution of all the land I have robbed him of to Master Roger Nowell, and as some compensation I would fain add certain lands adjoining, which have been conveyed over to Sir Ralph and Nicholas Assheton, only annexing the condition that a small sum annually be given in dole to the poor of this parish, that I may be remembered in their prayers." "We will see it done," said Sir Ralph and Nicholas. "And I will see my part fulfilled," said Nowell. "For any wrong you have done me, I now freely and fully forgive you, and may heaven in its infinite mercy forgive you likewise." "Amen," ejaculated the monarch, and all the others joined in the ejaculation. The king then moved to the door, which was opened for him by the two Asshetons. At the foot of the steps stood Master Potts, attended by an officer of the guard, and a party of halberdiers. In the midst of them, with their hands tied behind their backs, were Jem Device, his mother Jennet, and poor Nance Redfern. Jem looked dogged and sullen, Elizabeth downcast, but Jennet maintained her accustomed malignant expression. Poor Nance was the only one who excited any sympathy. Jennet's malice seemed now directed against Master Potts, whom she charged with having betrayed and deceived her. "If ever now deserted me, I should tear thee in pieces, thou ill-favoured little monster," she cried. "Monster in your own face, you hideous little wretch!" exclaimed the indignant attorney. "If you use such opprobrious epithets, I will have you gagged. You will be taken to Lancaster Castle and hanged." You're as bad as I am, and worse," replied Jennet, "and deserve hanging as well, and the king shall know your tricks," she vociferated, as James appeared at the door of the pavilion. "You wish to ensnare Alizon. You wish me to kill her. I was only your instrument." "Stop her mouth! Gag her!" cried Potts. "Nay, thou shalt stop my mouth. Thou shalt gag me," cried Jennet. "I win speak out. The king shall hear me. You're as bad as me." "All malice, your Majesty, all malice," cried the attorney. "Malice, no doubt, in great part," replied James, "but some truth as well, I fear, sir, and in any case it will prevent my doing anything for you." "There, you have ruined my hopes, you little wretch," cried Potts, furiously. "I'm right glad on't," said Jennet. "You may take me to Lancaster Castle, but you canna hang me. I know that full well. I shall get out, and then look to yourself, lad, for as sure as I'm Mother Demdike's granddaughter, I'll plague the life out of you." "Take the prisoners away, and let them be conveyed under a strict escort to Lancaster Castle," said James. "And as the assizes commence next week, quick work will be made with them, your Majesty," observed Potts. "Their guilt can be incontestably proved, and they are sure to be found guilty, sure to be hanged, sire." As the prisoners were removed, Nance Redfern looked round her,
and catching the eye of Nicholas, made a slight motion with her head, as if bidding them farewell. The squire returned the mute valediction. "Poor Nance!" he exclaimed compassionately. "I sincerely pity her. Would there was any means of saving her?" "There is none," observed Sir Ralph Assheton, "and you may be thankful that you are not brought in as her accomplice." As Jennet was taken away, she continued to hurl threats and imprecations against Potts. Another officer of the guard was then summoned, and when he came, James said, "One other prisoner remains within the pavilion. She likewise must be conveyed to Lancaster Castle, but in a litter, and not with the other prisoners." Attended by Sir Richard Houghton, the monarch then proceeded to his lodgings in the Tower. End of chapter 13. Book 3, Chapter 14 of The Lancashire Witches. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Andy Minter. The Lancashire Witches, A Romance of Pendle Forest, by William Harrison Ainsworth. Book 3, Houghton Tower. Chapter 14. One Grave. Notwithstanding the sad occurrences above detailed, James remained for 2 more days the guest of Sir Richard Houghton, enjoying his princely hospitality, hunting in the park, carousing in the great hall, and witnessing all kinds of sports. Nothing, indeed, was left to remind him of the sad events that had occurred. The prisoners were taken that night to Lancaster Castle, and Master Potts accompanied the escort to be ready for the assizes. The 3 judges proceeded thither at the end of the week. The attendance of Roger Nowell, Nicholas, and Sir Ralph Assheton was also required as witnesses at the trial of the witches. Sir Richard Assheton and Dorothy had returned, as already stated, to Middleton, and though the intelligence of the death of Richard and Alison was communicated to them with infinite caution, the shock to both was very great, especially to Dorothy, who was long, very long, in recovering from it. Nicholas's vivacity of temperament made him feel the loss of his cousin at first very keenly, but it soon wore off. He vowed amendment and reformation on the model of John Brewin, whose life offered so striking a contrast to his own that it has very properly been placed in opposition by a reverend moralist. But I regret to say that he did not carry out his praiseworthy intentions. He was apt to make a joke of John Brewin, instead of imitating his example. He professed to devote himself to his excellent wife, but his old habits would break out, and I am sorry to say he was often to be found in the alehouse, and was just as fond of horse racing, cock-fighting, hunting, fishing, and all other sports as ever. Occasionally he occupied a leisure or a rainy day with a journal, parts of which have been preserved. Author's note: published by the Chetham Society, and admirably edited, with notes, exhibiting an extraordinary amount of research and information, by the Reverend R. Raines, M.A., F.S.A., of Mildrew Parsonage, near Rochdale. End of note. But he set down in it few of the terrible events here related, probably because they were of too painful a nature to be recorded. He died in 1625, at the early age of 35. But to go back. A few days after the tragical events at Houghton Tower, the whole village of Whalley was astir, but it was no festive occasion, no merry-making that called forth the inhabitants, for grief sat on every countenance. The day, too, was gloomy. The feathered summits of Whalley Nab were wreathed in mist, and a fine rain descended in the valley. The Calder looked dull and discoloured as it flowed past the walls of the ancient abbey. The church bell tolled mournfully, and a large concourse was gathered in the churchyard. Not far from one of the 3 crosses of Paulinus, which stood nearest the church porch, a grave had been digged, and almost every one looked into it. The grave, it was said, was intended to hold 2 coffins. Soon after this, a train of mourners issued from the ancient abbey gateway, and sure enough there were 2 coffins on the shoulders of the bearers. They were met at the gate by Dr. Ormerod, who was so deeply affected as scarcely to be able to perform the needful offices for the dead. The principal mourners were Sir Richard Assheton of Middleton, Sir Ralph Assheton, and Nicholas. Amid the tears and sobs of all the bystanders, the bodies of Richard and Alison were committed to the earth, laid together in one grave. Thus was their latest wish fulfilled. Flowers grew upon the turf that covered them, and there was the earliest primrose seen, and the latest violet. Many a fond youth and trusting maiden have visited their lowly tomb, and many a tear, fresh from the heart, has dropped upon the sod covering the ill-fated lovers. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15. Book 3 of The Lancashire Witches. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Andy Minter. The Lancashire Witches, a Romance of Pendle Forest, by William Harrison Ainsworth. Book 3, Houghton Tower. Chapter 15. Lancaster Castle. Behold the grim and giant fabric, rebuilt and strengthened by old John of Gaunt, time-honoured Lancaster. Within one of its turrets, called John of Gaunt's Chair, and at eventide, stands a lady under the care of a gaoler. It is the last sunset she will ever see, the last time she will look upon the beauties of earth, for she is a prisoner, condemned to die an ignominious and terrible death, and her execution will take place on the morrow. Leaving her alone within the turret, the gaoler locks the door and stands outside it. The lady casts a long, lingering look around. All nature seems so beautiful, so attractive. The sunset upon the broad, watery sands of Morecambe Bay is exquisite in varied tints. The fells of Furness look black and bold, and the windings of the Lune are clearly traced out. But she casts a wistful glance towards the mountainous ridges of Lancashire, and fancies she can detect among the heights the rounded summit of Pendle Hill. Then her gaze settles upon the grey old town beneath her, and as her glance wanders over it, certain terrible objects arrest it. In the area before the castle she sees a ring of tall stakes. She knows well their purpose, and counts them. They are 13 in number. 13 wretched beings are to be burned on the morrow. Not far from the stakes is an enormous pile of faggots. All is prepared. Fascinated by the sight, she remains gazing at the place of execution for some time, and when she turns, she beholds a tall, dark man standing beside her. At first she thinks it is the gaoler, and is about to tell the man she is ready to descend to her cell. Then she recognises him, and recoils in terror.
"I can save thee from the stake if thou wilt, Alice Nutter," he said.
"Hence!" she exclaimed. "Thou temptest me in vain. Hence!"
And with a howl of rage, the demon disappeared. Conveyed back to the cell, situated within the dread dungeon tower, Alice Nutter passed the whole of that night in prayer. Towards 4 o'clock, wearied out, she dropped into a slumber, and when the clergyman, from whom she had received spiritual consolation, came to her cell, he found her still sleeping, but with a sweet smile upon her lips, the first he had ever beheld there. Unwilling to disturb her, he knelt down and prayed by her side. At length the gaoler came, and the executioner's aid. The divine then laid his hand upon her shoulder, and she instantly arose. "I am ready," she said cheerfully. "You have had a happy dream, daughter?" he observed. "A blessed dream, reverend sir," she replied. "I thought I saw my children, Richard and Alison, in a fair garden. Oh, how angelic they looked, and they told me I should be with them soon." "And I doubt not the vision will be realised," replied the clergyman. "Your redemption, if fully worked out, and your salvation, I trust, secured. And now you must prepare for your last trial." "I am fully prepared," she replied.
But will you not go to the others?" "Alas, my dear daughter," he replied, "they all, excepting Nance Redfern, refuse my services, and will perish in their iniquities." "Then go to her, sir, I entreat of you," she said. "She may yet be saved. But what of Jennet? Is she too to die?" "No," replied the divine. "Being evidence against her relatives, her life is spared." "Heaven grant she do no more mischief!" exclaimed Alice Nutter. She then submitted herself to the executioner's assistance, and was led forth. On issuing into the open air, a change came over her, and such an exceeding faintness that she had to be supported. She was led towards the stake in this state, but she grew fainter and fainter, and at last fell back in the arms of the men who supported her. Still they carried her on, when the executioner put out his hand to receive her from her aids. She was found to be quite dead. Nevertheless, he tied her to the stake, and her body was consumed. Hundreds of spectators beheld those terrible fires, who exulted in the torments of the miserable sufferers. Their shrieks and blasphemies were terrific, and the place resembled a hell upon earth. Jennet escaped, to the dismay of Master Potts, who feared she would wreak her threatened vengeance upon him. And indeed he did suffer from aches and cramps, which he attributed to her, but which were more reasonably supposed to be owing to rheum caught in the marshes in Pendle Forest. He had, however, the pleasure of assisting at her execution, when some years afterwards retributive justice overtook her. Jennet was the last of the Lancashire witches. Ever since then, witchcraft has taken a new form with the ladies of the county, though their fascination and spells are as potent as ever. Few can now escape them, few desire to do so, but to all who are afraid of a bright eye and a blooming cheek, and who desire to adhere to a bachelor's condition, to such I should say, beware of the Lancashire witches. End of chapter 15, end of book 3, and end of The Lancashire Witches by Harrison Ainsworth. Read for LibriVox by Andy Minter. Near Tring, Hertfordshire, October 2009.